Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. This is Joe, the bearded historian. He'll tell you an interesting story. Be careful of his soldiers, they can be brats. This is Angel, she's an entity. She'll cause chaos and plant her hands at you. This is Sue, she likes spirits, not the alcohol. She's the reason this channel exists. This is David, he likes fire trucks. He's here occasionally. Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. We preserve his story. Good morning. It is Wednesday. In case you didn't know that. Fair warning, this is a long one. Started out with me looking up the history of the day, as used, and I saw two things that I thought would be fun combined. Unfortunately, Joe only mentioned one. We didn't get to the other one. He could have gone on, but this is already over an hour, so it's literally a history class today, guys. Literally. But before all that, I've got a jellyfish race. Jellyfish. Are you ready? Here we go. Shout out time. Here's a shout out just for you. You support me, so I support you. This shout out is for our friends. Let's see who it is today. There we go. Let's start. Alright. So we've got She Stole, we got Cruising Nuts, we got Ellis, we got Justice, Catching, TNT, Wit, Swoop, Mountain Inspiration, Ian, Jacob, Bubba, Reef, A&M, M&J, Wit, Judy May, Mayhem, Ella, Tay Eats, We Go, Nikki and Happy, Rye, Crazy, Swoop, Crystal, looks like A&M's going to be in the lead, One Busy, there's Cal King, Sylvia, Cable, coming from the back, Tramps, Richard, Eric, there's Frugal, 755's coming up. Oh, it looks like it's going to be a Tramps. Alright, this is Dave and Kathy. Ooh, get out of the way. Retired, began their travels in 2018. They've been to all 48 states, 6 provinces in Canada, and 2 states in Mexico. Kathy, unfortunately, does have Alzheimer's, but they are still living their best lives. As you can see, they like traveling and exploring. They're a sweet older couple, so check them out. They're also very popular. I didn't realize they were so high, but at 68K. So check them out, like, share, comment, and enjoy history class. Alright, our bearded historian is going to tell you about the first president and all the craziness that ensued.
Yes. Yeah, bearded historian here. We are talking about George Washington. Yes, a very long time ago. A galaxy far, far away. Someplace, someplace called Virginia.
Ooh.
Way out there. Well, to go all the way back to the very beginning of his time, and, you're talking 1700s, back when we were still English colonies. He was born in 1732, February 22nd, in Pope's Creek, Virginia, a colony of the British America. He would live to the age of 67 and pass on at Mount Vernon, Virginia. Between the two events, though, a lot of different things happened. His first public office was he was a surveyor of Culpeper County in the colony of Virginia. He would get military training in 1752, and he was granted to the rank of major in the Virginia Regiment. He would serve during the French and Indian War and get promoted to lieutenant colonel in 1754 and become head of the Virginia Regiment in 1755. He would also later be elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses and was named a delegate to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, which appointed him commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. Well, he would lead the American forces to a decisive victory over the British in the Revolutionary War, leading the British to sign the Treaty of Paris, which acknowledged the sovereignty and independence of the United States. He would resign his commission in 1783 after the conclusion of the war. He played an indispensable role in adopting and ratifying the Constitution, which replaced the Articles of Confederation in 1789. He was then elected president unanimously by the Electoral College in 1788 and 1792. As the first U.S. president, he implemented a strong, well-financed national government while remaining impartial to the fierce rivalry that emerged between cabinet members Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. And during the French Revolution, he proclaimed a policy of neutrality while additionally sanctioning the Jay Treaty. He set enduring precedents for the office of the president, including republicanism, a peaceful transfer of power, and the use of title Mr. President, and the two-term tradition. His 1796 farewell address, which actually is coming up in like one day, became a preeminent statement on republicanism, in which he wrote about the importance of national unity and the dangers that regionalism, partisanship, and foreign influence pose to it. Surprisingly enough, a couple things that are actually affecting our country these days. Now, Washington's image is an icon of American culture. It's been on the dollar forever. He has been memorialized in monuments, a federal holiday, various media depictions, geographical locations, including the national capital, the state of Washington, stamps, and currency. In 1976, Washington was posthumously promoted to the rank of the General of the Armies, the highest rank in the U.S. Army. Washington consistently ranks in both popular and scholarly polls as one of the greatest presidents in American history. Now, go through a bit of this, and if you fall asleep in class, just, go into your 10th grade American history class. You'll catch a lot of this, or you might even ace the test. Again, born February 22nd, 1732, at Pope's Creek in Westmoreland County, Virginia. He was the first of 6 children of Augustine and Mary Ball Washington. His father was a justice of the peace and a prominent public figure who had 4 additional children from his first marriage to Jane Butler. The family moved to Little Hunting Creek in 1734 before eventually settling in Ferry Farm near Fredericksburg, Virginia. When Augustine died in 1743, Washington inherited Ferry Farm and 10 slaves. His older half-brother Lawrence inherited Little Hunting Creek and renamed it Mount Vernon. Now, Washington did not have the formal education his elder brothers received at the Appleby Grammar School in England, but he did attend the Lower Church School in Hartfield. He learned mathematics, including trigonometry and land surveying, and became a talented draftsman and map maker. By early adulthood, he was writing with considerable force and precision. As a teenager, to practice his penmanship, Washington compiled over 100 rules for social interaction styled Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior in Company and Conversation, copied from an English translation of a French book of manners.
Interesting.
Yeah. Washington often visited Mount Vernon and Belvoir, the plantation of William Fairfax, Lawrence's father-in-law. Fairfax became Washington's patron and surrogate father. In 1748, Washington spent a month with the team surveying Fairfax's Shenandoah Valley property. The following year, he received a surveyor's license from the College of William and Mary. Even though Washington had not served the customary apprenticeship, Thomas Fairfax appointed him surveyor of Culpeper County in Virginia, where he took the oath of office on July the 20th, 1749. He subsequently familiarized himself with the frontier region, and although he resigned from the job in 1750, he continued to do surveys west of the Blue Ridge Mountains. By 1752, he had bought almost 1,500 acres in the valley and owned 2,315 acres total. In 1751, Washington left mainland North America for his first and only time when he accompanied Lawrence to Barbados, hoping the climate would cure his brother's tuberculosis. Washington contracted smallpox during the trip, which left his face slightly scarred. Lawrence died in 1752, and Washington leased Mount Vernon from his widow, Anne. He inherited it outright after her death in 1761. Now, Lawrence Washington's service as Adjutant General of the Virginia Militia inspired George to seek a commission. Virginia's Lieutenant Governor, Robert Dinwiddie, appointed Washington as a major and commander of 1-4 militia districts. The British and French were competing for control of the Ohio Valley. The British were constructing forts along the Ohio River, and the French between the Ohio River and Lake Erie. Well, in October 1753, Dinwiddie appointed Washington as a special envoy. He sent Washington to demand the French forces to vacate land that was claimed by the British. Washington was also appointed to make peace with the Iroquois Confederacy and to gather further intelligence about the French forces. Well, Washington met with the half-king Tatacharion and other Iroquois chiefs at Logstown and gathered information about their numbers and locations of the French forts, as well as intelligence concerning individuals taken prisoners by the French. Washington was nicknamed Conotakarius by Takakurason, and the name, meaning devourer of villages, had been given to his great-grandfather John Washington at the late 17th century by Susquehannock. Washington's party reached the Ohio River in November 1753 and was intercepted by a French patrol. The party was escorted to Fort Le Boeuf, where Washington received in a friendly manner. He delivered the British demand to vacate the French commander, St. Pierre, but the French refused to leave. St. Pierre gave Washington his official answer after a few days' delay, as well as food and winter clothing for his party's journey back to Virginia. At least they're civilized.
Have some food, now leave.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or, give us your guns, your clothes, and go on back home. But, gave them some supplies, some goods, winter clothing. They completed the precarious mission in 77 days in difficult winter conditions, achieving a measure of distinction when his report was published in Virginia and London. Now, in 1754, Dinwiddie promoted Washington to lieutenant colonel and second in command of the 300-strong Virginia regiment, with orders to confront the French forces at the forks of the Ohio. Washington set out with half the regiment in April and soon learned a French force of 1,000 had begun construction of Fort Duquesne there. In May, having set up a defensive position at Great Meadows, he learned the French had made camp 7 miles away, and he decided to go on the offensive. The French detachment proved to only be about 50 men, so Washington advanced on May 28th with a small force of Virginians and Indian allies to ambush them. During the ambush, French forces were killed outright with muskets and hatchets, including the French commander Joseph Coulon de Jumonville, who had been carrying a diplomatic message for the British. The French later found their countrymen dead and scalped, blaming Washington, who had retreated to Fort Necessity. The full Virginia regiment joined Washington at Fort Necessity the following month with news that he had been promoted to command of the regiment and colonel upon the regimental commander's death. The regiment was reinforced by an independent company of 100 South Carolinians, led by Captain James Mackay. His royal commission outranked Washington's, and a conflict of command ensued. I'm bigger. No, I'm bigger. On July 3rd, a French force attacked with 900 men, and the ensuing battle ended with Washington surrendering. He signed a circular document in which he unwittingly took responsibility for assassinating Jumonville, later blaming the translator for not properly translating it. In the aftermath, Colonel James Innes took command of the intercolonial forces, and the Virginia regiment was divided, with Washington offered a captaincy in one of the newly formed regiments. He refused, however, as it would have been a demotion, and instead resigned his commission. The Jumonville affair became an incident which ignited the French and Indian War, later would become part of the 7 Years' War. Now, in 1755, Washington served voluntarily as an aide to General Edward Braddock, who led a British expedition to repel the French from Fort Duquesne in the Ohio country. On Washington's recommendation, Braddock split the army into one main column and a lightly equipped flying column. Suffering from severe dysentery, Washington was left behind, and when he rejoined Braddock at Mongolia, the French and their Indian allies ambushed the divided army. 2/3 of the British force excuse me. 2/3 of this British force would become casualties, including the mortally wounded Braddock. Under command of Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Gage, Washington, still very ill, rallied the survivors and formed a rear guard, allowing the remnants of the force to disengage and retreat. Always better to retreat and fight another day.
Right?
During the engagement, he had 2 horses shot out from under him, and his
dear.
hat and coat were bullet-pierced. His conduct under fire redeemed his reputation among critics of his command in the Battle of Fort Necessity, but he was not included by the succeeding commander, Colonel Thomas Dunbar, in planning subsequent operations. The Virginia Regiment was reconstituted on August 1755, and Dunwiddle appointed Washington its commander, again with the rank of colonel. Washington clashed with seniority almost immediately, this time with John Dagworthy, another captain of superior royal rank who commanded a detachment of Marylanders from the regiment's headquarters at Fort Cumberland. Washington, impatient for an offensive against Fort Duquesne, was convinced Braddock would have granted him a royal commission and pressed his case in February 1756 with Braddock's successor as Commander-in-Chief William Shirley, and again in January 1757 with Shirley's successor, Lord Loudoun. They seem to have a problem keeping people in employment.
No.
Now, Shirley ruled in Washington's favor only in the matter of Dagworthy. Loudoun humiliated Washington, refused him a royal commission, and agreed only to relieve him of responsibility for manning Fort Cumberland. Now, in 1758, the Virginia Regiment was assigned to the British Forbes expedition to capture Fort Duquesne. Washington disagreed with General John Forbes' tactics and chosen route. Forbes, nevertheless, made Washington a brevet brigadier general, that's a lot of letters,
Yes.
And gave him a command of one of the 3 brigades that would assault the fort. The French had abandoned the fort and the valley before the assault, however, and Washington only saw a friendly fire incident which left 14 dead and 26 injured. Let's shoot at anybody, class. Frustrated, he resigned his commission soon afterwards and returned to Mount Vernon. Now, under Washington, the Virginia Regiment had defended 300 miles of frontier against 20 Indian attacks in 10 months. He increased the professionalism of the regiment as it grew from 300 to 1,000 men, and Virginia's frontier population suffered less than the other colonies. Though he failed to realize the Royal Commission, he gained self-confidence, leadership skills, and knowledge of the British military tactics. Their destructive competition Washington witnessed among colonial politicians fostered his later support for a strong central government. Now, on January 6, 1759, Washington, at age 26, married Martha Dandridge Custis, a 27-year-old widow of the wealthy plantation owner Daniel Parke Custis. The marriage took place at Martha's estate. She was intelligent, gracious, and experienced in managing a planter's estate, and the couple had a happy marriage. They moved to Mount Vernon, near Alexandria, where he lived as a planter of tobacco and wheat, and emerged as a political figure. Washington's 1751 bout with smallpox was thought to have rendered him sterile, though it was equally likely that Martha may have sustained injury during the birth of Patsy, her final child, making additional births impossible. The couple lamented not having any children together. Despite this, the two raised Martha's 2 children, John Parke Custis, Jackie, and Martha Parke Custis, Patsy, and later Jackie's 2 youngest children, Eleanor Parke Custis, Nellie, and George Washington Parke Custis, along with numerous nieces and nephews. Well, the marriage gave Washington control over Martha's 1/3 dower interest in the 18,000-acre Custis estate, and he managed the remaining 2/3 of Martha's children. The estate also included 84 slaves. As a result, he became one of the wealthiest men in Virginia, which increased his social standing. Well, at Washington's urging, Governor Lord Bourtetort fulfilled Dunwiddle's 1754 promise of land bounties to the all-volunteer militia during the French and Indian War. In late 1770, Washington inspected the lands in the Ohio and Great Cowina regions, and he engaged surveyor William Crawford to subdivide it. Crawford allotted 23,200 acres to Washington. Washington told the veterans that their land was hilly and unsuitable for farming, and he agreed to purchase 20,147 acres, leaving some feel that they'd been duped. I would say so. He also doubled the size of Mount Vernon to 6,500 acres, and by 1775 had increased its slave population to more than 100.
Okay.
Now, as a respected military hero and large landowner, Washington held local offices and was elected to the Virginia provincial legislature representing Frederick County in the House of Burgesses for 7 years, beginning in 1758. He first ran for the seat in 1755, but was soundly beaten by Hugh West. When he was running in 1758, Washington plied voters with beer, brandy, and other beverages. Are you thirsty, buddy? Despite being away serving at the Forbes expedition, he won the election with roughly 40% of the vote, defeating 3 opponents with the help of local supporters. Well, early in his legislative career, Washington rarely spoke or even attended legislative sessions. He had later become a prominent critic of Britain's taxation policy and mercantilist policies towards the American colonies, and became more politically active starting in the 1760s. Well, Washington imported luxuries and other goods from England, paying them by exporting tobacco. The prolific spending, combined with low tobacco prices, left him 1,800 pounds in debt by 1764.
Oh dear, we started already in debt.
Yep, prompting him to diversify his holdings.
All Washington's fault.
Yep, all Washington. A year later, because of erosion and other soil problems, he changed Mount Vernon's primary cash crop from tobacco to wheat, and expanded operations to include corn, flour, milling, and fishing. Washington soon was counted among the political and social elite in Virginia, and from 1768 to 1775, he invited some 2,000 guests to Mount Vernon, most of whom he considered people of rank and was known to be exceptionally cordial towards guests. Washington also took time for leisure with fox hunting, fishing, dances, theater, cards, backgammon, and billiards. Well, Washington's stepdaughter, Patsy, suffered from epileptic attacks from age 12, and she died at Mount Vernon in 1773. The following day, he wrote to Burwell Bassett, "It's easier to conceive than to describe the distress of this family." He canceled all business activity and remained with Martha every night for 3 months.
That's kind of nice.
Yeah. Now, Washington would play a central role before and during the American Revolution. His distrust of the British military had begun when he was passed over for promotion into the regular army. It's kind of understandable. Opposed to taxes imposed by the British Parliament in colonies without proper representation, he and other colonists were also angered by the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which banned American settlement west of the Allegheny Mountains and protected the British fur trade. Washington also believed that the Stamp Act of 1765 was an act of oppression and celebrated its repeal the following year. In March 1766, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, asserting that parliamentary law superseded colonial law. In the late 1760s, the interference of the British Crown in American lucrative western land speculation spurred the American Revolution. Washington was a prosperous land speculator, and in 1767 he encouraged adventurers to acquire backcountry western lands. Washington helped lead widespread protests against the Townshend Acts passed by Parliament in 1767, and he introduced a proposal in May of 1769 which urged Virginians to boycott British goods, and the acts were mostly repealed in 1770. Now, Parliament sought to punish Massachusetts colonists for their role in the Boston Tea Party in 1774 by passing the Coercive Acts, which Washington saw as an invasion of our rights and privileges. He said Americans must not submit to acts of tyranny, since custom and use shall make us as tame and abject slaves as the blacks we rule over with such arbitrary sway. That July, he and George Mason drafted a list of resolutions for the Fairfax County Committee, including a call to end the Atlantic slave trade, which were adopted. Well, on August 1st, Washington attended the First Virginia Convention. There he was selected as a delegate to the First Continental Congress, and as tensions rose in 1774, he helped train militias in Virginia and organized enforcement of the Continental Association, boycott of British goods instituted by Congress. Well, the American Revolutionary War broke out on April 19, 1775, with battles at Lexington and Concord and the Siege of Boston. Upon hearing the news, Washington was sobered and dismayed, and he hastily departed Mount Vernon on May 4, 1775, to join the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Now, on January 14, 1775, Congress created the Continental Army, and John Adams nominated Washington as its commander-in-chief, mainly because of his military experience and the belief that Virginia would better unite the colonies. He is unanimously elected to Congress the next day. Washington appeared before Congress in uniform, gave an acceptance speech on the 16th and declining a salary, though he would later be reimbursed expenses. Washington was commissioned on June the 19th and officially appointed by Congress as General and Commander-in-Chief of the Army of the United Colonies and of all the forces raised or to be raised by them. He was then instructed to take charge of the siege of Boston, July 22nd, 1775. Now, Congress chose his primary staff officers, including Major General Artemus Ward, Adjutant General Horatio Gates, Major General Charles Lee, Major General Philip Schuyler, and Major General Nathaniel Greene. Henry Knox, a young bookkeeper, impressed Adams in Washington with ordnance knowledge and was subsequently promoted to Colonel and Chief of Artillery. Similarly, Washington was impressed by Alexander Hamilton's intelligence and bravery. He would later promote him to colonel and appoint him as aide-de-camp. Washington initially banned the enlistment of blacks, both free and enslaved, into the Continental Army. The British saw this opportunity to divide the colonies, and the colonial governor of Virginia issued a proclamation which promised freedom to slaves if they joined the British. Desperate for manpower in late 1777, Washington relented and overturned his ban, and by the end of the war, around one-tenth of Washington's army were blacks. Following the British surrender, Washington sought to enforce the terms of the Preliminary Treaty of Paris by reclaiming slaves freed by the British and returning them to servitude.
Well then, come fight for me, and then I'm going
to throw you back in. Yeah, thanks, dude. He arranged to make this request to Sir Guy Carleton on May 6, 1783. Instead, Carleton issued 3,000 freedom certificates, and all former slaves of New York City were able to leave before the city was evacuated by the British in late November 1783. Early in 1775, in response to this growing rebellious movement, London sent British troops to occupy Boston, led by the General Thomas Gage, commander of the British forces in America. They set up fortifications, making cities impervious to attack. Local militias surrounded the city and effectively trapped the British troops, resulting in a standoff. Washington headed for Boston, which word of his march preceded him, and he was greeted everywhere. Gradually, he became the symbol of the Patriot cause. Upon Washington's arrival in August, on July the 2nd, 1775, 2 weeks after the Battle of Bunker Hill, he set up headquarters in Cambridge. When he went to inspect the army, he found an undisciplined militia. After consultation, he initiated Benjamin Franklin's suggested reforms, drilling the soldiers and imposing strict discipline. Washington ordered his officers to identify the skills of recruits to ensure military effectiveness while removing incompetent officers. He petitioned Gage, his former superior, to release captured Patriot officers from prison and treat them humanely. In October of 1775, King George III declared that the colonies were in open rebellion and relieved Gage of command for incompetence, replacing him with General William Howe. Now, the Continental Army, reduced to only 9,600 men by January 1776 due to expiring short-term enlistments, had to be supplemented with militia. Soon they were joined by Knox with heavy artillery captured from Fort Ticonderoga. When the Charles River froze over, Washington was eager to cross and storm Boston, but General Gates and others were opposed to the untrained militia striking well-garrisoned fortifications. Instead, he agreed to secure the Dorchester Heights, 100 feet above Boston, and with Knox's artillery to try to force the British out. Let's drop a load on them.
Hey.
On March 9th, under the cover of darkness, Washington's troops bombarded British ships in the Boston harbor. On March 17th, 9,000 British troops and loyalists began a chaotic 10-day evacuation aboard 120 ships. Soon after, Washington entered the city with 500 men, with explicit orders not to plunder the city. He refrained from exerting military authority in Boston, leaving civilian matters in the hands of local authorities. Now, after the victory in Boston, Washington correctly guessed that the British would return to New York City, a loyalist stronghold, and retaliate. He arrived there on April 13, 1776, and ordered the construction of fortifications to thwart the suspected British attack. He also ordered the occupying forces to treat civilians and their property with respect to avoid the abuses Bostonians had suffered at the hand of the British troops. Now, Howe transported his resupplied army with the British fleet from Halifax to New York City. George Germain, who ran the British war effort in England, believed it could have been won with one decisive blow. The British forces, including more than 100 ships and thousands of troops, began arriving on Staten Island on July the 2nd to lay siege to the city. After the Declaration of Independence was unanimously adopted on July 4th, Washington informed his troops on July 9th that Congress had declared the United Colonies to be free and independent states. Now, Howe's troop strength totaled 32,000 regulars and Hessian auxiliaries, and Washington's consisted of 23,000, mostly raw recruits and militia. In August, Howe landed 20,000 troops at Gravesend, Brooklyn, and approached Washington's fortifications. Opposing his generals, Washington chose to fight, based on inaccurate information that Howe's army only had 8,000 plus troops. In the Battle of Long Island, Howe assaulted Washington's flank and inflicted 1,500 Patriot casualties, the British suffering 400. Washington would retreat, instructing General William Heath to acquire rivercraft. On August 30th, General William Alexander held off the British and gave cover while the army crossed the East River under darkness to Manhattan without loss of life or material, although Alexander was captured. Howe was emboldened by his Long Island victory and dispatched Washington as George Washington, Esquire, to futility to negotiate peace. Washington declined, demanding that he be addressed with diplomatic protocol as general and fellow belligerent, not as a rebel, lest his men be hanged if such if captured. The Royal Navy bombarded the unstable earthworks on Lower Manhattan Island. Despite misgivings, Washington heeded the advice of Generals Greene and Putnam to defend Fort Washington. They were unable to hold it. Washington abandoned the fort and ordered his army north to the White Plains. Fun little tidbit, I found out one of my relatives was up here at White Plains.
No.
Now, Howe's pursuit forced Washington to retreat across the Hudson River to Fort Lee to avoid encirclement. Howe landed his troops on Manhattan in November and captured Fort Washington, inflicting high casualties on the Americans. Washington was responsible for delaying the retreat, although he blamed Congress and General Greene. Loyalists in New York City considered Howe a liberator and spread a rumor that Washington had set fire to the city. Well, Patriot morale reached its lowest when Lee was captured. Now reduced to 5,400 troops, Washington's army retreated through New Jersey, and Howe broke off pursuits to set up winter quarters in New York. Now, Washington would cross the Delaware River into Pennsylvania, while Lee's replacement, General John Sullivan, joined him with 2,000 more troops. The future of the Continental Army was in doubt due to a lack of supplies, a harsh winter, expiring enlistments, and desertions. Washington was disappointed that many New Jersey residents were loyalists or skeptical about independence. Now, Howe split up his army and posted a Hessian garrison in Trenton to hold western New Jersey and the east shore of the Delaware. Desperate for victory, Washington and his general devised a surprise attack on Trenton. The army was to cross the Delaware in 3 divisions, one led by Washington with 2,400 troops, another by James Ewing with 700, and a third by Colonel John Cadwallader, 1,500. Cadwallader, great name. The force was then split, with Washington taking the Pennington Road and General Sullivan traveling south on the river's edge. Washington ordered the 60-mile search for Dunham boats to transport his army and the destruction of vessels that could be used by the British. He personally risked capture while staking out the Jersey shoreline alone leading up to the crossing. Washington crossed the Delaware on Christmas night, 1776. His men followed the ice-obstructed river from McConkey's Ferry with 40 men per vessel. The wind turned up the waters, and they were pelted with hail, but by 3 a.m., they made it across with no losses. Knox was delayed, managing frightened horses and about 18 field guns on flat-bottom ferries. Cadwallader and Ewing failed to cross due to the ice and heavy currents. Once Knox arrived, Washington proceeded to Trenton, rather than risk being spotted returning his army to Pennsylvania. Well, the troops spotted the Hessian positions a mile from Trenton, so Washington split his force into 2 columns, rallying his men. Soldiers, keep by your officers, and for God's sake, keep by your officers. The 2 columns were separated at the Birmingham crossroads. General Greene's column took the upper Ferry Road, led by Washington, and General Sullivan's column advanced on River Road. The Americans marched in sleet and snowfall. Many were shoeless with bloodied feet, and 2 died of exposure.
Nothing.
At sunrise, Washington, aided by Colonel Knox and the artillery, led his men in a surprise attack on the unsuspecting Hessians and their commander, Colonel Johann Rall. The Hessians had 22 killed, including Colonel Rall, 83 wounded, and 850 captured with supplies. These guys just drop and run.
Run, run.
They didn't run very far. They got captured. Well, Washington retreated across the Delaware and Pennsylvania and returned to New Jersey on January 3rd, 1777.
He sure did a lot of running and retreating.
Yes, he did. We're going to go run over here, then we're going to run back, then we're going to run over here
I
again.
suppose that's how he lived so long, but he did a lot of retreating.
Yes, he did. Launching an attack on British regulars at Princeton with 40 Americans killed or wounded and 273 British killed or captured. American generals Hugh Mercer and John Cadwalader were being driven back by British when Mercer was mortally wounded. Washington arrived and led his men in a counterattack which advanced to within 30 yards of the British line. Now, some British troops retreated after a brief stand, while others took refuge in Nassau Hall, which became the target of Colonel Alexander Hamilton's cannons. Washington troops charged, and British surrendered in less than an hour, and 194 soldiers laid down their arms. Howe retreated to New York City, where his army remained inactive until early the next year. Washington took up winter headquarters in Jacob Arnold's Tavern in Morristown, New Jersey. I am here to take and defend as the general. While in Morristown, Washington's troops disrupted British supply lines and expelled them from parts of New Jersey. Now, during his stay in Morristown, Washington ordered the inoculation of Continental troops against smallpox. Now, this went against the wishes of the Continental Congress, who had issued a proclamation prohibiting it, but Washington feared the spread of smallpox in the army. The mass inoculation proved successful, with only isolated infections occurring and no regiments incapacitated by the disease.
It's kind of cool.
Yeah. The British still controlled New York, and many Patriot soldiers did not re-enlist or deserted after the harsh winter campaign. Congress instituted greater rewards for re-enlisting and punishments for desertion to effect greater troop numbers. Now, strategically, Washington's victories at Trenton and Princeton were pivotal. They revived Patriot morale and quashed the British strategy of showing overwhelming force, followed by offering generous terms, changing the course of the war. In February of 1777, word of the American victories reached London, and the British realized the Patriots were in position to demand unconditional independence. Well, in January 1777, British General John Burgoyne led the Saratoga campaign south from Quebec through Lake Champlain to the recaptured Fort Ticonderoga, intending to find New England, including control of the Hudson River. However, General Howe in the British-occupied New York City blundered, taking his army south to Philadelphia rather than up the Hudson River to join Burgoyne near Albany. Now, Washington and Gilbert de Monthier, Marquis de Lafayette, rushed to Philadelphia to engage Howe. At the Battle of Brandywine on September 11, 1777, Howe outmaneuvered Washington and marched unopposed into the nation's capital at Philadelphia. A Patriot attack failed against the British at Germantown in October. In upstate New York, the Patriots were led by General Horatio Gates. Concerned about the Burgoyne's movement southward, Washington sent reinforcements north with General Benedict Arnold, his most aggressive field commander, and Benjamin Lincoln. On October 7, 1777, Burgoyne tried to take the Bemis Heights, but was isolated from support by Howe. He was forced to retreat to Saratoga and ultimately surrendered after the battles of Saratoga. As Washington suspected, Gates' victory emboldened his critics. The biographer John Alden maintains it was inevitable that the defeats of Washington's forces and concurrent victory of the forces in upper New York should be compared. Admiration for Washington was waning, including little credit from John Adams. Now, Washington and his Continental Army of 11,000 men went into winter quarters at Valley Forge, north of Philadelphia, in December of 1777. There they lost between 2,000 and 3,000 men, as a result of disease and lack of food, clothing, and shelter. The British were comfortably quartered in Philadelphia, paying for supplies in pounds sterling, while Washington struggled with a devalued American paper currency. The woodlands were soon exhausted of game. By February, Washington was facing lowered morale and increased desertions among his own troops. An internal revolt by his officers, led by Major General Thomas Conway, prompted some members of the Congress to consider removing Washington from command. Washington's supporters resisted, and the matter was dropped after much deliberation. Once the plot was exposed, Conway wrote on an apology to Washington, resigned, and returned to France. Now, Washington made repeated petitions to Congress for provisions. He received a congressional delegation to check on the Army's condition and expressed the urgency of the situation, proclaiming something must be done, important alterations must be made. He recommended the Congress expedite supplies, and Congress agreed to strengthen and fund the Army Supply Alliance by reorganizing the Commissary Department. By late February, supplies began arriving. Meanwhile, Baron Frederick Wilhelm von Steuben's incessant drilling transformed Washington's recruits into a disciplined fighting force by the end of the winter camp. For his services, Washington promoted von Steuben to Major General and made him Chief of Staff. In early 1778, the French responded to Burgoyne's defeat and entered into a treaty of alliance with the Americans. Congress ratified this treaty in May, which amounted to the French declaration of war against Britain. In 1778 May, Howe resigned and was replaced by Sir Henry Clinton. Now, the British evacuated Philadelphia for New York that June, and Washington summoned a war council of American and French generals. He chose a partial attack on the retreating British at the Battle of Monmouth. Generals Charles Lee and Lafayette moved to 4,000 men without Washington's knowledge and bungled their first attack on June the 28th. Washington relieved Lee and achieved a draw after an expansive battle. At nightfall, the British continued their retreat to New York, and Washington moved his army outside the city. Monmouth was Washington's last battle in the North. Now, Washington became America's first spy master, designing an espionage system against the British. In 1778, Major Benjamin Tallmadge formed the Culper Ring in Washington's direction to covertly collect information about the British in New York. Washington had disregarded incidents of disloyalty by Benedict Arnold, who had distinguished himself in many campaigns, including his invasion of Quebec and the Battle of Saratoga. In 1780, Arnold began supplying the British spy master John André with sensitive information intended to compromise Washington and capture West Point, the key American defensive position on the Hudson River. Now, historians Nathaniel Philbrick and Ron Chernow noted possible reason for Arnold's defection to be his anger at losing promotions to junior officers or repeated slights from Congress. His also deeply in debt, profiteering from the war, and disappointed by Washington's lack of support during his eventual court-martial. Now, after repeated requests, Washington agreed to give Albert Arnold command of the West Point in August. On September 21st, Arnold met André and gave him the plans to take over the garrison. While returning to British lines, André was captured by militia, who discovered the plans, and upon hearing the news of his capture on the 24th, while waiting to greet and have breakfast with Washington, Arnold immediately fled to the HMS Vulture. The ship had brought André to West Point and escaped to New York. Now, upon being told of Arnold's treason, Washington recalled his commanders positioned near or under Arnold at key points around the fort to prevent any complicity. He assumed personal command at West Point and reorganized its defenses. André's trial for espionage ended in a death sentence, and Washington offered to return him to the British in exchange for Arnold, but Clinton refused. André was hanged on October the 2nd, 1780, despite his request for a firing squad to deter other spies. Let's go for a swing. Now, in late 1778, General Clinton shipped 3,000 troops from New York to Georgia and launched a southern invasion against Savannah, reinforced by 2,000 British and Loyalist troops. They repelled an attack by American patriots and French naval forces, which bolstered the British war effort. In June 1778, Iroquois warriors joined with Loyalist Rangers, led by Walter Butler, and killed more than 200 frontiersmen, laying waste to the Wyoming Valley in northeastern Pennsylvania. In mid-1779, in response to this and other attacks on New England towns, Washington ordered General John Sullivan to lead an expedition to force the Iroquois out of New York, effecting the total destruction and devastation of their villages and taking their women and children hostage. This expedition systematically destroyed the Iroquois villages and food stocks and forced at least 5,000 Iroquois to flee to British Canada. This campaign directly killed a few hundred Iroquois, but according to historian Ryan Kohler, the net effect was to reduce the Iroquois by half. They became unable to survive the harsh winter of 1779 and 1780. Some historians now describe this campaign as genocide. On my point of view, they sided with the British. They put their lot into life.
Right.
Washington's troops went into quarters at Morristown again for the worst winter of the war, where temperatures went well below freezing. New York Harbor was frozen, snow covered for the ground for weeks, and troops again lacked provisions. Well, in January, Clinton assembled 12,500 troops and attacked Charlestown, South Carolina, defeating General Benjamin Lincoln, and by June they occupied the South Carolina Piedmont. Clinton returned to New York and left 8,000 troops under the command of General Charles Cornwallis. Now, Congress replaced Lincoln with Horatio Gates after his defeat at the Battle of Camden. Gates was replaced by Nathanael Greene, Washington's initial choice, but the British had firm control of the South. Washington was reinvigorated, however, when Lafayette returned from France with more ships, men, and supplies, and 5,000 veteran French troops led by Marshal Rochambeau arrived at Newport, Rhode Island in July of 1780. French naval forces had landed, led by Admiral de Grasse. Now, Washington's army went into winter quarters at New Windsor, New York, in December of 1780, and he urged Congress and state officials to expedite provisions so the army would not continue to struggle under the same difficulty they had hitherto endured. On March 1st, 1781, Congress ratified the Articles of Confederation, but the government that took effect on March 2nd did not have the power to levy taxes, and it loosely held the states together. Now, the General Clinton sent Benedict Arnold, now a British brigadier general, with 1,700 troops to Virginia to capture Portsmouth and continue to conduct raids on Patriot forces. Washington responded by sending Lafayette south to counter Arnold's efforts. Washington initially hoped to bring the fight to New York, drawing the British forces from Virginia and ending the war there, but Rochambeau advised him that Cornwallis in Virginia would be a better target. De Grasse's fleet arrived off the Virginia coast, cutting off British retreat. Seeing this advantage, Washington made a feint towards Clinton in New York, then headed south to Virginia. Well, the siege of Yorktown was one of a decisive victory of the combined forces of the Continental Army, commanded by Washington, and the French Army, commanded by General Comte de Rochambeau, and the French Navy, commanded by Admiral de Grasse. In August 19th, the march to Yorktown, led by Washington and Rochambeau, began, which is known now as the Celebrated March. Washington was in command of 7,800 Frenchmen, 3,100 militia, and 8,000 Continentals. Inexperienced in siege warfare, he often deferred to the judgment of General Rochambeau and relied on his advice. Despite this, Rochambeau never challenged Washington's authority as the battle's commanding officer. By late September, Patriot French forces surround Yorktown, trapping the British Army and prevented British reinforcements from Clinton in the north, while the French Navy emerged victorious at the Battle of the Chesapeake. The final American offensive began with a shot fired by Washington. The siege would end with the British surrender on October 19, 1781. Over 7,000 British soldiers became prisoners of war. Washington negotiated terms of surrender for 2 days, and after the official ceremony took place on October 19th, Cornwallis claimed illness and was absent, sending General Charles O'Hara as his proxy. As a gesture of goodwill, Washington had a dinner for the American, French, and British generals, all of whom fraternized on friendly terms and identified with one another as members of the same military caste. Now, afterwards, Washington moved the army to New Windsor, New York, and they remained stationed there until the Treaty of Paris was signed on September the 3rd, 1783, formally ending the war. Although the peace treaty did not happen for 2 years following the end of the battle, Yorktown proved to be the last significant battle or campaign of the Revolutionary War, with British Parliament agreeing to cease hostilities on March 1782. Now, a lot of the general information from there, he would wind up resigning his post of Commander-in-Chief. He would wind up being selected as president of the new states in 1789, inaugurated on April 30th, 1789, taking the oath of office at Federal Hall in New York City. His coach was led by a militia and marching band and followed by statesmen and foreign dignitaries in an inaugural parade. A lot of people were surprised. Here was a bunch of colonists who defeated one of the biggest empires in the world at the time. I mean, they beat Great Britain. They surprised the George III. Chancellor Robert R. Livingston administered the oath using a Bible provided by the Masons, after which a militia fired a 13-gun salute. Washington read a speech in the Senate chamber asking that Almighty Being consecrate the liberties and happiness of the people of the United States. Though he wished to serve without a salary, Congress insisted he accept it, later providing Washington $25,000 per year to defray costs of the presidency, equivalency to today $6.39 million. Now, Washington wrote to James Madison, "As the first of everything in our situation will serve to establish a precedent, it is devoutly wished on my part that these precedents be fixed on true principles. To that end, he preferred the title Mr. President over more majestic names proposed by the Senate, including His Excellency, His Highness the President."
Yeah.
His executive precedents included the inaugural address, messages to Congress, and the cabinet form of the executive branch. Now, he did plan to resign after his first term, but political strife convinced him to remain in office. He was an able administrator and a judge of talent and character, and he regularly talked with department heads to get their advice. He tolerated opposing views despite fears a democratic system would lead to political violence, and he conducted a smooth transition of power to his successor. He remained the only nonpartisan throughout the presidency, the only U.S. president to do so, and opposed the divisiveness of political parties, but favored a strong central government, sympathetic to the Federalist form of government, and leery of Republican opposition. Now, Washington did deal with some major problems. For one, their Confederation idea started running up major bills. They had weak leadership, no executive, a workload bureaucracy of clerks, large debt, worthless paper money, no power to establish taxes. How are you going to take and pay for things if you can't collect taxes? So he had the task of assembling an executive department and relied on Tobias Lear, for advice on selecting officers. Now, Britain refused to relinquish its forts in the American West, and Barbary pirates were preying on American merchant ships in the Mediterranean before the U.S. even had a navy. Now, some of these folks, it's kind of a who's who. You've got Vice President John Adams. Later, he would be president. Acting Secretary of State, you had John Jay, Thomas Jefferson, Edmund Randolph, Timothy Pickering. Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. Secretary of War was Henry Knox. Later, Timothy Pickering would also be selected. Edmund Randolph was the Attorney General. William Bradford and Charles Lee eventually would also become Attorney Generals. Now, Congress created executive departments in 1789, including the State Department, the War Department, the Treasury Department. Again, Attorney General Samuel Osgood as Postmaster General, Thomas Jefferson Secretary of State, Henry Knox Secretary of War. Washington's cabinet became a consulting and advisory body not mandated by the Constitution. Well, Washington's cabinet members formed rival parties with sharply opposing views, mostly fiercely illustrated between Hamilton and Jefferson. Washington restricted cabinet discussions to topics of his choosing without participating in the debate. He occasionally requested cabinet opinions in writing and expected department heads to agreeably carry out his decisions. Now, they also felt they had to deal with domestic issues. He was apolitical and opposed the formation of parties, suspecting the conflict would undermine republicanism. He exercised great restraint in using his veto power, writing that I give my signature to many bills with which my judgment is at variance. His closest advisor formed two factions, pretending the first party system. Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton became the Federalist Party to promote national credit in a financially powerful nation, while Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson opposed Hamilton's agenda and founded the Jeffersonian Republicans. Washington favored Hamilton's agenda, however, and it ultimately went into effect, resulting in bitter controversy. Now, Washington would proclaim the day of Thanksgiving, 1789, November 26th, to encourage national unity. It's the duties of, he wrote, it is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey His will, and to be grateful for His benefits, and humbly to implore His protection and favor. He spent that day fasting and visiting debtors in prison to provide them with food and beer. Heck of an idea. Now, in response to two anti-slavery petitions that were presented to Congress in 1790, slaveholders in Georgia and South Carolina threatened to blow the trumpet of civil war.
Oh, no.
They already wanted to split the nation. Now, Washington and Congress responded with a series of racist measures. Naturalization was denied to black immigrants. Blacks were barred from serving in state militias. The Southwest Territory, later the state of Tennessee, was permitted to maintain slavery, and two more slave states were admitted, Kentucky in 1792, and again Tennessee in 1796. Now, on February 12, 1793, Washington signed into law the Fugitive Slave Act, which overrode state laws and courts, allowing slave agents to cross state lines to return escaped slaves. Now, many free blacks in the North decried the law, believing it would allow bounty hunting and kidnapping. The Fugitive Slave Act gave effect to the Constitution's Fugitive Slave Clause, and the act was passed overwhelmingly in Congress. Now, at the same time, Washington signed a reenactment of the Northwest Ordinance in 1789, which had freed all slaves brought before 1787 into the vast expanse of federal territory north of the Ohio River, except for slaves escaping from slave states. The law lapsed when the new Constitution was ratified in 1789. He also signed the Slave Trade Act of 1794, which sharply limited American involvement in the Atlantic slave trade. On February 18, 1791, Congress admitted the Free State of Vermont into the Union as the 14th state on March 4, 1791. Now, his first term was primarily devoted to economic concerns. Again, the whole paper currency was not flying off the shelves, while England was using silver. Establishment of public credit became a primary challenge for the federal government. Hamilton submitted a report to a deadlocked Congress, and he, Madison, and Jefferson reached a compromise of 1790 in which Jefferson agreed to Hamilton's debt proposals in exchange for moving the nation's capital temporarily to Philadelphia and then south near Georgetown on the Potomac River. The terms legislated in the Funding Act of 1790 and the Residence Act, both of which Washington signed into law. Congress authorized the assumption and payment of the nation's debts with funding provided by custom duties and excise taxes. Hamilton caused controversy in the cabinet by advocating for the establishment of the first bank of the United States. Madison and Jefferson objected to the idea, but legislation creating the bank easily passed Congress. Now, Jefferson and Randolph insisted the federal government was going beyond its constitutional authority. Hamilton argued that the government could charter the bank under the implied powers granted by the Constitution. Washington sided with Hamilton and signed the bank legislation on February the 25th, 1791. Now, the rift between Hamilton and Jefferson, however, became openly hostile.
Oh, no.
Now, the nation's first financial crisis occurred in March 1792. Hamilton's Federalists exploited large loans to gain control of U.S. debt securities, causing a run on the national bank, and markets returned to normal by mid-April. Jefferson believed Hamilton was part of the scheme despite Hamilton's efforts to ameliorate. Now, Jefferson and Hamilton adopt diametrically opposed political principles. Hamilton believed in a strong national government requiring a national bank and foreign loans to function, while Jefferson believed the states and the farm element should be primarily directly government. He also resented the idea of banks and foreign loans. To Washington's dismay, the two men persistently entered into disputes and infighting. Hamilton demanded that Jefferson resign if he could not support Washington, and Jefferson told Washington that Hamilton's fiscal system would lead to the overthrow of the Republic. Washington urged them to call a truce for the sake of the nation, but they ignored him. Jefferson's political actions, his support of Fredo's National Gazette, and his attempts to undermine Hamilton nearly led Washington to dismiss him from the cabinet. Ultimately, he resigned his position in December 1793, and Washington forsook him. This feud led to well-defined Federalist and Republican parties, and party affiliation became necessary for election to Congress by 1794. Washington remained aloof from congressional attacks on Hamilton, but did not publicly protect him. The Hamilton-Reynolds sex scandal opened Hamilton to disgrace, but Washington continued to hold him in very high esteem. In March of 1791, at Hamilton's urging, with support from Madison, Congress imposed an excise tax on distilled spirits to help curtail the national debt, which took effect in July. Grain farmers strongly protested the Pennsylvania's frontier districts. They were arguing that they were underrepresented and were shouldering too much of the debt compared to the situation on British taxation pre-revolution. On August 2nd, Washington assembled his cabinet to discuss the situation. Unlike Washington, who had reservations about using force, Hamilton was eager to suppress the rebellion with federal authority. Wanting to avoid involving the federal government, Washington first called on Pennsylvania state officials to take initiative, but they declined. You want some? Go do it yourself. So, on August 7th, Washington issued his first proclamation for calling up state militias. After appealing for peace, he reminded the protesters that, unlike the rule of the British Crown, the federal law was issued by state-elected representatives. Now, threats and violence against tax collectors, however, escalated in defiance against the federal authority in 1794 and gave rise to the Whiskey Rebellion.
Whiskey!
Washington issued a final proclamation September 25th threatening to use military force to no avail. The federal army was not up to the task, so Washington invoked the Militia Act of 1792 to summon state militias. Governors sent troops, initially commanded by Washington, who handed over command to Henry Lee to lead them into the rebellious districts. They took 150 prisoners, and the remaining rebels dispersed. 2 of the prisoners were condemned to death, but Washington exercised his constitutional authority for the first time and pardoned them. Now, Washington's forceful action demonstrated that the new government could protect itself and its tax collectors. This represented the first use of federal military force against the states and citizens. Washington justified his actions against certain self-created societies, and he regarded as subversive organizations that threatened the national union. He did not dispute the right to protest, but he insisted that their dissent must not violate federal law. Congress agreed and extended their congregations to him. Only Madison and Jefferson expressed indifference. It's like, how dare you?
How dare you?
Now, in April 1792, the French Revolutionary War began between Britain and France, and Washington declared America's neutrality. The revolutionary government of France sent diplomat Edmond Charles Genet to America, and he was welcomed with great enthusiasm. He created a network of new democratic republic societies promoting France's interests, but Washington denounced them and demanded that French recall Genet. The National Assembly of France granted Washington honorary French citizenship on August 26, 1792, during the early stages of the French Revolution. Now, Hamilton formulated the Jay Treaty to normalize trade relations with Britain, while removing them from Western forts, but also resolved the financial debts remaining from the Revolution. Chief Justice John Jay acted as Washington's negotiator, assigned the treaty on November 19, 1794. Critical Jeffersonians, however, supported France. Washington deliberated while they then supported the treaty because it avoided war with Britain, but it was disappointed that its provisions favored Britain. He mobilized public opinion and secured ratification at the Senate, but faced frequent public criticism. The British agreed to abandon their forts around the Great Lakes, with the United States modifying the boundary of Canada. The government liquidated numerous pre-revolution debts, and the British opened the British West Indies to American trade. The treaty secured peace with Britain and a decade of prosperous trade. Jefferson claimed it had angered France and invited rather than avoided war. Relations with France deteriorated after that, and 2 days before Washington's term ended, the French Directory declared the authority to seize American ships, leaving succeeding President John Adams with prospect of war.
Oh dear.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, we have the second term, which, again, he was getting tired of office, poor health, dealing with the infighting in his own cabinet with partisan critics. He showed little enthusiasm for a second term, and Martha also wanted him not to run. Washington's nephew, George Augustine Washington, managing Mount Vernon in his absence, was critically ill, further increasing Washington's desire to retire. Many, however, urged him to run for a second term. Madison told him that his absence would not only allow the dangerous political rift in the cabinet and the House to worsen, Jefferson also pleaded with him not to retire, agreeing to drop his attacks on Hamilton, and stated he would also retire if Washington did. Let's all abandon the capital.
Yeah, nobody wants to be capital.
Nope. Well, on February 13th, 1793, the Electoral College unanimously re-elected Washington president and John Adams president by a vote of 77 to 50. He was sworn into office by Associate Justice William Cushing March 4th, 1793, in the Senate Chamber of Commerce Hall in Philadelphia. Afterward, Washington gave a brief address before immediately retiring to the President's house. On April 22nd, 1793, the French Revolutionary Wars broke out, and Washington issued the proclamation which declared American neutrality. He was resolved to pursue a conduct friendly and partial towards the belligerent powers, while also warning Americans not to interfere in the conflict. While Washington recognized France's revolutionary government, he would eventually ask French minister to recall Edmond Charles Guenet, be recalled over the Citizen Guenet affair. Guenet was a diplomatic troublemaker who was openly hostile towards America's neutrality policy. Well, they wanted us to join in and, play cop, apparently.
It's their job.
Now, interestingly enough, he procured 4 American ships as privateers to strike at Spanish forces, British allies in Florida, while organizing militias to strike other British possessions. However, his efforts failed to draw the United States into the conflict. Now, on July 31st, 1793, Jefferson submitted his resignation from the cabinet. Hamilton, desiring more income for his family, also resigned from office in January 1795 and was replaced by Oliver Wolcott Jr. While his relationship with Washington would remain friendly, Washington's relationship with Secretary of War Henry Knox deteriorated after rumors that Knox had profited from contracts for the construction of U.S. frigates which had been commissioned under the Naval Act of 1794 in order to combat Barbary pirates, forcing Knox to resign. Now, in his final months of the presidency, Washington was assailed by his political foes and a partisan press which accused him of being ambitious and greedy. He became to regard the press as a disuniting, diabolical force of falsehoods. Kind of sounds like CNN.
No.
At the end of his second term, Washington retired for personal and political reasons, dismayed with personal attacks, and to ensure that a truly contested presidential election could be held. He did not feel bound by a 2-term limit, but his retirement set a significant precedence. Now, as a letter written by President George Washington as a valedictory to friends and fellow citizens after 20 years of public service, Washington's letter wrote at the end of his presidency, near the end, before retiring to his home in Mount Vernon. It was published as the address of General Washington to the people of America on his declining the presidency of the United States in Claypool's American Daily Advisor, September 19th, 1796, about 10 weeks before the presidential electors cast their votes in the election. In it, he writes about the importance of national unity while warning Americans of the political dangers of regionalism, partisanship, and foreign influence, which they must avoid to remain true to their values. It almost immediately was reprinted in newspapers around the country and later in pamphlet form. Now, the first draft was originally prepared by James Madison, June 1792, as Washington contemplated retiring at the end of his first term. However, he set it aside and ran for the second term because of the heated disputes between Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, which convinced Washington the growing tensions would rip the country apart without his leadership. This included the state of foreign affairs, the divisions between the new formed Federalist and Democratic Republican parties. The second term came to close 4 years later. Washington prepared a revision of the original letter with the help of Hamilton to write a new farewell address to announce his intention to decline a third term of office. He would reflect on the emerging issues of the American political landscape in 1796, express his support for the government 8 years after the adoption of the Constitution, and defend his administration's records and give valedictory advice to the American people. The letter also attempted to reunite the country, which had partially turned against Washington following the 1794 Jay Treaty. Now, the thought of the United States without George Washington as the president caused concern among many Americans. Thomas Jefferson disagreed with many of his policies and later led the Democratic Republicans in opposition to many Federalist policies, but he joined his political rival, Alexander Hamilton, leader of the Federalists, in convincing Washington to delay his retirement and serve the second term. The two men feared the nation would also be torn apart without his leadership. Washington most likely referred to this when he had told the American people he wanted to retire before last election, but he was convinced by people, in his words, entitled to my confidence that the duty to serve a second term. Now, all of the ideas presented in Washington's farewell address came from Washington. However, Alexander Hamilton wrote most of it. Washington sought to convince the American people that his service was no longer necessary by telling them, as he did in the first inaugural address, that he truly believed he was never qualified to be president. If he accomplished anything during the presidency, he said, it was the result of the support and the efforts of the country to help survive and prosper. Despite his confidence the country would survive without his leadership, Washington used the majority of the letter to offer advice as a parting friend on what he believed was the greatest threats of the nation. The address would express Washington's understanding of republicanism and affirming popular government and warning about threats to Republican liberty. He begins his warnings to the American people by stressing their independence, peace at home and abroad, safety, prosperity, and liberty are all dependent upon unity among the states. No. He warned that the union of states created by the Constitution will come under the most frequent focused attacks by foreign and domestic enemies of the country. He warns the American people to be suspicious of anyone who seeks to abandon the Union, secede a portion of the country from the rest, or weaken the bonds that hold together the constitutional union. Interestingly enough, less than 70 years from this point, the whole South decided to do just that. Now, to promote the strength of the Union, he urges people to place their identity as Americans above their identities of members of a state, country, or region, and to try to focus their efforts and affection on the country above all other local interests. He reminds people that they do not have more than the slight differences of religion, manners, habits, and political principles, that their triumph and possession of independence and liberty are the result of working together. Washington continues to express his support of the Union by giving some examples of how he believes that the country, its regions, and its people are already benefiting from the unity which currently share. He then looks to the future in his belief that the combined effort and resources of its people will protect the country from foreign attack and allow them to avoid wars between neighboring nations that often happen due to rivalries and competing relations with foreign nations. He argues that the security provided by the Union will also allow the United States to avoid the creation of an overgrown military, which he sees as a great threat to liberty, especially the Republic of Liberty the United States has created. Washington goes on to warn the American people to question the ulterior motives of any person or group which argues that the land within the borders of the United States is too large of a land to be ruled as a republic, an argument made many by the people during the debate of the proposed purchase of the Louisiana Territory, calling on the people to give the experiment of a large republic a chance to work before deciding it cannot be done. He then also offers strong warnings on the dangers of sectionalism, arguing that the true motives of a sectionalist are to create distrust and rivalries between regions and people to gain power and take control of the government. Washington points to the Jay Treaty and the Picnics Treaty, which established the borders of the United States Western Territories between Spanish Mexico and British Canada, and secured the rights of Western farmers to ship goods along the Mississippi River to New Orleans. He holds up these treaties as proof that the eastern states along the Atlantic coast and the federal government are looking out for the welfare of all American people and can win fair treatment from foreign countries as a united nation. Washington would also go on to state his support for the new constitutional government, calling it an improvement upon the nation's original attempt in the Articles of Confederation. He reminds the people that it is the right of the people to alter the government to meet their needs, but it should only be done through constitutional amendments. He reinforces this belief by arguing that violent takeovers of the government should be avoided at all costs, you anarchists.
Oh, no.
And that it is the duty of every member of the Republic to follow the Constitution and to submit to the laws of government until it is constitutionally amended by the majority of the American people. Washington warns that political factions may seek to obstruct the execution of laws created by the government or to prevent the branches of government by exercising powers provided them by the Constitution. Such factions may claim they are trying to answer popular demands or solve pressing problems, but their true intentions are to take power from the people and place it in the hands of unjust men. Washington is talking about Washington. Just kidding.
No.
Washington calls the American people are the only people to change the Constitution through amendments, but he then warns that groups seeking to overthrow the government may strive to pass constitutional amendments to weaken the government to a point where it is unable to defend itself from political factions, enforce its laws, and to protect the people's rights and property. As a result, he urges them to give the government time to realize its full potential and only amend the Constitution after thorough time and thought have proven to make it truly necessary, instead of simply making changes based upon opinions and hypotheses of the moment.
Ooh.
So for somebody from the 1700s, he had quite a head for how situations were going to play out. Again, talking about, the dangers of politics, the political parties, the Hamilton Republican Party, the Federalist Party. Washington strove to remain neutral during the conflict between Britain and France, but Washington would recognize it's natural for people to organize and operate within groups such as political parties, but also argues that every government has recognized political parties as the enemy and has sought to repress them because of their tendency to seek more power than other groups and take revenge on political opponents. Gee, that wouldn't sound anything like what happened with the last election, but
no, that's not the same.
Heaven forbid, not like rounding people up or anything. He says sometimes the fact that parties are sometimes beneficial in promoting liberty in monarchies, but argues that political parties must be restrained in popularly elected government because their tendency to distract the government from their duties created unfounded jealousies among groups and regions, raise false alarms among the people, promotes riots and insurrection, and provide foreign nations and interests access to the government where they can impose their will upon the country. Nothing like a certain country like China, inside Washington, inside New York City. But again, it also talks about checks and balances. Washington continues the defense of the Constitution, stating that the checks and balances and the separation of powers within it are important means of preventing a single person or group from seizing control of the country. He advises the American people that if they believe that it is necessary to modify the powers granted to the government through the Constitution, it should be done through constitutional amendments instead of through force. But, after 8 years being president, after fighting in the Revolutionary War, Washington finally got his vacation time, and he was, our most popular president. I mean, more than a couple times I've seen his name at the top list, because you think here was a guy who started from, more simpler, easy beginnings. He started out in the British, working out in the Ohio Valley area. He got basically passed over several times by stuck-up British military people, but eventually would lead the country in establishing a nation and help win the Revolutionary War and become president. So, but this has been a rambling bearded historian piece. You folks have a good week, and we will see you next week. Bye-bye.